Hello, everyone. A very warm St. Andrew's welcome to everyone joining us from across the globe today. My name is Moira Sharkey, and I serve as a gift officer in the development office for the University of St. Andrews. True to our global community, I am joining you from just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. As part of the development office, I have the great privilege of engaging alumni, parents, and friends to support the university philanthropically and to foster a strong St. Andrews community all across the world. For today's Meet the Author event, it is my honor to welcome home author and alumna Isabel Cañas, known in this community as Isabel Lachenauer. We will start today hearing from Isabel herself about her time at St. Andrews and her journey as an author, followed by a reading from the Hacienda. And then we'll open it up to your questions. Please do be thinking of your questions and feel free to pop those into the chat at any time. After we've heard from Isabel a little bit, I will go ahead and publish those and we'll hear her responses to them. Isabel is a 2013 graduate of the University of St. Andrews, having received her MA in Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies. Just this year, Isabel also earned her PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago. Congratulations. Isabel is Mexican-American and truly a citizen of the world, has lived in Mexico, Scotland, Egypt, and Turkey, just to name a few. She now calls New York City home, though today she is joining us from Victoria. The Hacienda has received incredible early buzz. In addition to many starred reviews in trade publications, it was recently featured in the New York Times as part of its spring book preview. And it's been featured in Publishers Weekly. She has been featured in Publishers Weekly as one of 10 rising writers to watch. Isabel, welcome home to St. Andrews. We are thrilled to have you here virtually and so looking forward to hearing more about your debut novel, The Hacienda.
Thank you so much for having me, Mo. I can't tell you guys how excited and a little nervous to be talking to you all today. It's really a bit of a dream come true and a little surreal. I figured I'll just dive right in. I am going to be talking about both my time at St. Andrews and the publication of my first novel, The Hacienda, which came out on May 2nd and is available wherever books are sold. Because even though these are the paths that led me to these two events were very different, they both began with similar moments. And I'm talking about moments of rejection. And none of this softball rejection stuff. I mean, resounding, stinging, unanimous rejection. Because I never expected to go abroad for university. At the age of 18, I already knew that I wanted to study Arabic and Middle Eastern studies. And so I applied to universities in the US who were known for their focus on foreign language instruction. But in an act of what you could call teenage hubris, or maybe fate guiding my slightly arrogant 17-year-old hand, I refused to apply to so-called backup schools or backup universities. Because if it's a backup, I then reasoned it must be undesirable, right? In hindsight, the result was painfully predictable. I was rejected or waitlisted from every single university I applied to. Every single one. On the day my final two rejections arrived, which was a double whammy from my sister's university and my mother's alma mater, I was pulled aside by my guidance counselor, who suggested that I come to a talk that was actually happening later that week, given by representatives from the University of St. Andrews. From the moment I met them and heard about St. Andrews's excellent Arabic language instruction, I knew it was fate. Also, how could a little American teenager resist the beckoning of a Scottish accent, you know? So they took me in, I was accepted, and in September of 2009, I hopped on a flight across the pond and I never looked back. People often ask me if I studied creative writing while at university, but the truth is, I don't believe that it's necessary to do so in order to become a successful writer. The only true prerequisite to becoming a writer is to live and to observe different kinds of people, to meet different kinds of people, and through compassion and empathy to try and understand them. My education at St. Andrews gave me 4 years of experiences abroad in 2 different countries, not just Scotland, but also Egypt, because I did an exchange in my 3rd year with the American University of Cairo. These experiences taught me so much more than how to write essays fueled by coffee from Taste or how to get coveted tickets to your favorite ball. Everything I learned alongside students hailing from all corners of the globe, And so my horizons shifted. I changed, and I met people who would change my life for years to come. In a classic, an embarrassingly classic St. Andrews story, I met my husband while at university. At the beginning of my 4th year, I moved into a flat full of strangers on Queen's Terrace, and I vividly remember coming downstairs into the kitchen one bright sunny morning in August to meet one of my new flatmates, a wiry, charismatic Canadian guy called Rob, and the rest is St. Andrews history. But it was when I was on my honeymoon with him that I received another life-changing rejection. It was 10 years later, in the autumn of 2019, 10 years after I had first hopped on that fateful flight to Edinburgh. And my husband Rob and I had just arrived in Mexico City, where my family had lived in the 90s. At that point in my writing career, I had a literary agent, but all of my progress had stalled. My agent and I had tried and failed, really failed, to sell 2 young adult fantasy manuscripts in as many years. And one afternoon, while in Mexico City, I received a particularly devastating rejection, the last and the most disheartening of dozens that I had received on a novel that I had really poured my heart into and worked hard on. And when I read that email, I was in the lobby of actually the Anthropology Museum, which was my favorite museum as a kid. And I sat down on a bench and I began to sob. I am not a public crier, but I cried. And as my husband comforted me, in my gut, I had this realization where I knew I had reached a point in my writing career when I needed to try something different. I needed to pivot. And so at the time I was nursing an idea for a historical novel that had some haunted house elements. And so I wiped my tears away and told myself I would work on that project next. I was in the perfect place to begin thinking about it because I love late October in Mexico City, and not just because of all the marigolds that are all over the city adorning altars in preparation for the Day of the Dead. I really love the rainy season, perhaps another reason why I really enjoyed my time at St. Andrews. My childhood memories of life in Mexico City are full of clouds swinging low over the city every single afternoon, their dark bellies heavy with rain, and of falling asleep watching forks of lightning crack across my bedroom window. And it was on one such night after that really devastating rejection, I lay awake in the dark, listening to a thunderstorm tire itself out, as I used to as a child. And as I drifted off, I heard a voice in my head, crisply narrating what I instinctively knew as a writer was the beginning of something new. I snatched my phone off the nightstand and began typing frantically, as many writers do in the middle of the night, racing to pin the voice that I heard down before it slipped away. And those words that I wrote on my phone in the middle of the night in Mexico City became the first chapter of the Hacienda. I wrote the first half of that novel in November of 2019, all the time I had in 3 weeks. I only had 3 weeks before returning to teach at the University of Chicago, where Mo said I got my PhD. And then in March of 2020, term ended abruptly. I returned home to New York City, and I stayed there, trapped in a tiny studio apartment, listening to sirens wail through the city's empty, haunted streets. I hadn't worked on the Hacienda in several weeks. I told myself I can't write it now. I am too anxious. I am too afraid. But fear, I think, was exactly what the Hacienda needed. So I tiptoed back into the book and was immediately consumed by it. I revised the existing material that I had, about 40,000 words or half of the novel, and I wrote the final half in 2 feverish weeks in April of 2020. At 5 weeks total, it is the fastest I have ever written a book. It is not normal. It was exhilarating. I have never been caught so off guard by a project. As a horror writer, I often meditate on what we fear and why. Getting on a plane and arriving in St. Andrews, sight unseen, taught me at the age of 18, knowing nothing about life in the United Kingdom, taught me that I had nothing to fear from rejection, for it was rejection that led me there. And I treasure the Hacienda, and I'm so excited and grateful to talk to you all about it today, not only because it is my debut novel, which makes it special, but because it taught me to embrace the unknown. It taught me to let go of my fear of rejection, and it taught me to trust that for every no I ever hear in my life, a new door will open in its stead. So without further ado, I would love to read you those opening pages that came to me in the middle of the night in Mexico City from the first chapter of the Hacienda. Chapter 1. Andrés. Hacienda San Isidro, Noviembre 1823. The low sweep of the southern horizon was a perfect line, unmarred by even the smudge of horses tossing their heads in the distance. The road yawned empty. The carriage was gone. I stood with my back to the gates of Hacienda San Isidro. Behind me, high white stucco walls rose like the bones of a long-dead beast jutting from dark, cracked earth. Beyond the walls, beyond the main house and the freshly dug graves behind the capilla, the tlachiqueros took their machetes to the sharp fields of maguey. Wandering the fields as a boy taught me that agave flesh does not give like a man's. The tlachiqueros lift their machetes and bring them down again and again, each dull thud seeking the heart's sweet sap, each man becoming more intimately acquainted with the give of meat beneath metal, with the harvesting of hearts. A breeze snaked into the valley from the dark hills, its dry chill stinging my cheeks and the wet in my eyes. It was time to turn back, to return to my life as it was. Yet the idea of turning, of gazing up at San Isidro's heavy wooden doors alone, slicked my palms with sweat. There was a reason I had once set my jaw and crossed San Isidro's threshold, a reason why I had passed through its gates like a reckless youth from legends of journeys to the underworlds. That reason was gone. And still I stood in the center of the dirt road that led away from San Isidro, away from Apan, my eyes fixed on the horizon with the fervor of a sinner before their saint, as if the force of my grief alone could transcend the will of God and return that carriage, return the woman who had been taken from me. The echo of retreating hoofbeats and the clouds of dust they left curled in the air like copal incense, mocking me. It is said that mortal life is empty without the love of God, that the ache of loneliness's wounds is assuaged by obedience to him, for in serving God we encounter perfect love and are made whole. But if God is the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, if he is three in one in the Trinity, then God knows nothing of loneliness. God knows nothing of standing with his back to a gray morning, of dropping to his knees in the dust, of his shoulders slumping beneath a new weight of knowing what it meant not to be alone, and an acute awareness of his chest's own emptiness. God knows nothing of loneliness, because God has never tasted companionship as mortals do, clinging to one another in darkness so complete and sharp it scrapes flesh from bone, trusting one another even as the devil's breath blooms hot on their napes. Sharp pebbles dug into my kneecaps through my worn trousers as I knelt, my breathing labored, too exhausted to sob. I knew what the maguey felt. I knew the whine of the machete. I knew how my chest gave beneath the weight of its fall. I knew how it felt to have my heart harvested, sweet aguamiel carving wet, winding tracks down my hollowed chest, my wound's sinful stigmata, flinching and festering in the sun. God knows nothing of being alone. Alone is kneeling in the dust, gazing at an empty horizon. In the end, it was not the ink-slick shadows and echoing, dissonant laughter of San Isidro that broke me. It was not fear that carved my chest open. It was losing her. Thank you, everyone.
Isabel, thank you so much. Oh, that was so fantastic. The book is incredible. It's absolutely amazing. So for anyone who has not yet read it, go pick it up right here. It's also phenomenal on Audible, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and the process that Isabel went through as the author in thinking about the different mediums through which people would experience this story. So getting into that, Isabel, talking a little bit more about the book and what inspired you to write it and your process. Would love to dig into that. I'm just going to catch myself quickly and say a housekeeping item. Again, please do feel free to enter your questions into the chat, and we'll go ahead and read them for Isabel to answer as we go throughout this. But selfishly, as the new self-appointed fan of your president of your fan club, allow me to dig in. So thinking about the book, The Hacienda, it begins at the end, and without giving anything away, talking about what that process was like for you, especially as this inspiration came to you nearly 200 years after the setting in which you put the Hacienda. How did you decide on that setting on 1823 and the end of the war in terms of determining how you were going to tell this story and how you were going to weave in the historical concepts into what happens between Andres, Beatriz, and the rest of the characters?
That is a fantastic question. And I think a lot of it comes down to, for lack of a more precise professional term, vibes. I had not an obsession, but a healthy curiosity in the period in which this book is set. This book takes place in 1823 with a past timeline that happens 2.5-ish years before the events of the book in 1823. And it occurs right in Mexico's immediately post-colonial period. So in the 1820s, Mexico fought a war of independence from Spain that lasted 11 years. And it was a very, it was more than a war of independence. It was also a war of civil strife. So one of the things I considered when I began writing this book was I knew I wanted to populate it with familiar Gothic archetypes, because I knew, like, okay, this is more of an unfamiliar setting for your average Anglo-American reader. So how do I make it, how do I put in familiar set pieces so the rest of it sweeps them away, so the reader has an anchor? And I thought, well, while I was at St. Andrews, I actually did 1 semester of English in my first year before I then populated the rest of my schedule with history and Arabic. And we read a lot of Gothic novels, and that is something that I loved as a teenager. I loved Dracula. I loved Wuthering Heights. We also read Beloved at St. Andrews, which was a novel that absolutely is stunning. Like, I highly recommend it to everyone. It is an incredible, uncanny work of unmitigated genius. It's brilliant how Toni Morrison characterizes people and also the haunted house in the book. So the Gothic was a great inspiration for me. So I thought, okay, this novel, I want it to have like classic Gothic archetypes, the wealthy, mysterious widower who our ingenue, heroine marries, not really knowing what his background is, not really knowing the full story about the death of his first wife. But, Beatriz at the beginning of the book is in a pretty precarious financial situation. So she says, to hell with it. I want to take care of myself. I want to make sure my mother and I are provided for. So I'm going to marry this guy. And I thought to myself, who at the end of this devastating civil conflict would have money? And through my research, I discovered that pulque, which is a kind of sour beer that is made from the same plant that is used to make mezcal and tequila, the agave or the maguey, was a very burgeoning industry in the 19th century. And so I thought, okay, somebody who makes alcohol might still have money, because there's a line in, I think, the second chapter of the book where it's like, empires will rise and fall, wars will be fought for this person or another, but men will always want to drink, so they will always buy drink. So part of my choosing the setting had to do with the fact that I was really interested by this period. It was tricky to research, which made it even more interesting and painful for me to dig into, but also it had classic features that lent itself to the exploration of the Gothic as a genre. And I think for fresh explorations of the Gothic as well, because it's a period in which we still see the very strong presence of the casta or caste system, which was prevalent throughout the Spanish Americas, whereby one's social status, sometimes legal status, usually by extension socioeconomic status, was determined by their racial makeup, with people of white Spanish descent being at the very top, people of indigenous and Black descent being at the bottom, a bunch of people in between. So because colorism and racism are two themes that are unfortunately still very dominant in Latin America and the Latin American diaspora today, conversations about colorism crop up in families of Latin American descent across the US. I know this from my own experience. that was something I wanted to address in the book. And so Beatriz, our heroine, comes from a socially as well as financially precarious position because she is of mixed heritage. Her father was mestizo, or mixed, and doesn't like to talk about his mixed heritage because he was trying to climb up through society. And when he is murdered, all she has is his name, the fact that he was murdered by the incoming government, because governments switched quite a lot in this period, and the fact that she knows that if she's not careful, her skin will turn darker in the sun, and that was a bit of an iffy thing. So that is at play in this book, and it puts her at more of in a socially precarious place, and it gives her something to fight for, because she knows that success and comfort and being taken care of financially will not come easily to her. She's got to work for it. So she's a very ambitious character, and I wanted to write a woman who was ambitious without making that out to seem like a bad thing. But yeah, that was some of the, usually when I approach a book, I have, you know, kind of a constellation of vibes. Like, I know I want this setting, I know I kind of want a character like this, and I come at it from a very like fuzzy, kind of everything's coming into focus, and then usually through research, things start to become crisper. So it was my research that really led me to this precise setting, this precise kind of hacienda, and the precise kinds of characters that I wanted in the book.
Oh, that's fascinating. And we have a couple questions coming in, and I'll get to those, but kind of staying with the theme about your research and the amount of research that you did. And it really is, I mean, it's a history lesson, and exactly, it's a cultural lesson as well, in addition to a really gripping and suspense horror story. But so how much research and how much did you know about this period already? And how much time did you spend researching the period after you had that kind of framework of the characters and what you wanted them to experience?
I actually spent less time researching it than I thought I would need to. Coming from an academic background, my PhD is in Near Eastern languages and civilizations. More narrowly speaking, I study, roughly speaking, the Ottoman Empire. So coming at writing a historical novel for the first time, I thought that I would have to do a ton of research. And I was mercifully, you know, kind of pushed off my research course by the fact that, by two things. One, the voice of the book came to me in a way that I can only describe as like the Greek genius or like the muse. Like, once I have a voice for a book, like I can't help but write it. Writing, many writers, I think if anybody in the audience listening knows writer is a writer, you know that in a way it's a compulsion. You can't not do it. Stories are incredibly addicting, and when you're a storyteller, it kind of defines your life. So once I had the voice that came to me in the middle of the night, I knew, like, I usually plan books very thoroughly in advance of writing them. I research them, I plan the world, I do a lot of work on the characters, but for this one, the voice came to me first, as well as like a vague idea about the setting. And I thought, well, I have to start. And so I did like a little bit of research at the beginning to try and find, like, okay, where is the hacienda going to be? What, like, agricultural industry will it be linked to? What is the period like? What are the politics like? Confusing is the answer. But I was also prevented from over-researching this book because of the pandemic lockdown that happened in March of 2020. So I wrote the first half of this book in November. Christmas happened, and then the University of Chicago is on, I guess you could call it a trimester schedule or a quarter system, where our term in the winter lasts from January to the endish of March. And so in January to March, I was teaching. I was really, really busy. I was marking all the time. Any other educators in the audience will know it's very demanding, creatively as well as in terms of energy and intellect. But so I did a little bit of research, and when we heard that everything was going to lock down, I sprinted to the library and, you know, scanned as many books as I could. But I didn't have access to the library that I would usually have for researching a book like this. So I was limited to online resources, which were, fortunately, a lot of things were made available online during lockdown. A lot of academic articles I could still access, but I discovered through the writing of this book that when you're writing historical fiction, all of your research must be in service of the story. Readers do not care what socks the protagonist is wearing unless it is relevant to the story. So that to me was a really important lesson to learn, and one that I only really figured out after I'd finished writing the novel. Because then I told the story to Mo when we chatted a few days ago. I once wrote a novella that was set in the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, which is one of my areas of expertise, a period about which I'm super passionate. And so I wrote this thing. I was so proud of myself. I was like, oh, I'm being enormously clever, putting in all of my research, all of these little Easter eggs, like, look at how much I know. I sent it off to my agent, and she emailed me back, and she was like, Isabel, this is a little dense. You know. So I think that was an important lesson. Sometimes if you, coming into this period, I came in as a layperson and not as a historian. I had my skills. I had the privilege of the resources that the University of Chicago offered me. I honestly should have put them in my acknowledgements for this book. Maybe I'll do that for the next one. But I was prevented slightly from over-researching, so it was a blessing in disguise.
Oh, that's so interesting, right? Because you could see how you could be mired down in the detail and in everything you do, you know, in the description of the silks and the buildings itself and what everybody's wearing. Like, I'm thinking about the baptism that Andreas performed and the way you described the crisp white shirts and the bright skirts, and you create such incredible imagery through your story. But the gift of not being, and as you say, it's a gift to not be mired down in every single detail, but also to get it right and to capture the ethos of the period. You know, it's such a skill. And so it's kind of staying on that theme of, you know, doing a lot without doing too much. We have a really terrific question from Tyler that I'll read here and then publish it. And Tyler is asking about your previous writing and the way that it played into the Hacienda. So he asks, Tyler has asked, can you comment on how you built up an extensive portfolio of short fiction? Again, the Hacienda is your debut novel, but you are a prolific writer. And again, we'll point people to your website where they can click on any numerous stories. And Tyler asking as well, how did this contribute to your efforts to publish a novel?
These the short stories and the long fiction kind of came hand in hand. First of all, thank you, Tyler, for your question. I think it's a great one, and one that I think is really important to talk about, especially for aspiring writers, because some writers don't know, like, if in terms of the path to publication, which is better? Like, should you write novels or should you write short stories and get them published and get them out there? The short answer to that is novels, period. I have much longer answers, and I wish I could explain. We don't have time to go into like the industry, the evil mechanisms behind the publishing industry that privilege the novel over short stories, because
you can be sure we'll have you back for another alumni event about that with the
I would love to talk about that. I would love to talk about that. I've learned a lot through lots of painful experiences. But for the short stories, I was always a natural novelist. I had an experience, unfortunately, when I was about 17. I was in a writing workshop where I was mocked for not writing literary fiction by the instructor, which blows my mind, because I was like, 17-year-olds are children. Like, why would you do that? Anyway, I told myself I was bad at writing, and I didn't write for many years after that, which is a crying shame. I began writing novels again in my last year of university, and at St. Andrews, which was fantastic. I have vivid memories of like planning a novel that is terrible and will never see the light of day while walking along West Sands. But the short stories happened because I went to a writing workshop called the Clarion West Writers Workshop, which is a science fiction and fantasy workshop located in Seattle, Washington. And it's the Clarion Workshop in San Diego and the Odyssey Workshop, which is based in New Hampshire, are predominantly short story-based workshops for writers of genre fiction, science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And so while I was at that workshop in summer of 2018, I wrote a lot of short stories for critique, got them critiqued by my brilliant, way better than me at short stories cohort, and after I left the workshop, started to get them published. When it comes to getting a novel published, unfortunately, having short stories published doesn't really attract much attention. I think it used to in the past. I think if you write literary fiction and you win like a massive award, like I don't know, you're popping out of the Iowa Writers Workshop and you win a pushcart award or something really, really shiny, maybe that'll help you get an agent, but that doesn't guarantee that your book will sell. So when it comes to commercial fiction, which is the realm in which I live, I can't really speak to super literary fiction as much, but when it comes to commercial fiction, it is always best to write a novel first, get an agent, write the best novel you possibly can, get an agent. And if you write short stories on the side, that will probably help your craft. I know that the exercise of writing short fiction has improved my ability to write novels immensely. They're very different. I often liken writing short stories to doing a puzzle made of glass. If you try and force it, everything will shatter, and then your fingers will be cut and bleeding. But writing short stories is an exercise in concision. And so you have to be very precise about the language that you choose and how much space you're wasting when you choose to write other things. It's also an exercise in revision, because you usually have to take a lot out to meet minimum word requirements, or maximum word requirements rather. So when it comes to publication, I think writing short stories probably won't help you a whole lot, but when it comes to improving your craft as a writer, writing short stories is incredibly useful, and I think has made me a much better writer.
Thank you, Isabel. That's so helpful. Staying along that theme with publishing, just generally, what has been the most surprising aspect of the publishing process for you?
I think I knew that having a book in the world meant that people would read it, because duh, obviously. But I was really happily taken aback by how many readers really connected with the book. Because when you write a novel, it's almost like you're living in a daydream. You're spending weeks and months perfecting a daydream. It's on paper and stuff, but really it's all up in here. And then all of a sudden it moves from here into someone else's mind. And they come to you and they say, oh, I love this about it, or I love that about it, or I really connected with this, or this made me feel really proud to be Mexican American and see this, see myself and my culture and hear names like mine in an audiobook, or to see it in a book. I think that for me, I kind of intellectually was aware that that would happen, but I wasn't prepared for how much that would move me emotionally. Not to get too much all up in my feelings, but it's been a real joy to share this book with people and to know that and to hear from them. I think hearing from readers is the number one surprise. I kind of guessed it would happen, but I didn't know it would have such an impact on me.
Oh, that's such a wonderful answer, because you never know how it's gonna reach somebody or what they're going through in their lives when they experience your book. And I use the word experience really deliberately, because I think it is a book that you don't just read and set it down. It's something that you take the story with you, and the themes and the characters with you. Oh, I have so many questions about your characters, who I love. I think that Juana deserves her own book. I want to know the background of Ana Luisa, who's the head housekeeper. There's so many different ways in which you can take this story and really this universe that you have created in a couple hundred pages. But getting personal, knowing a little bit more about your background, knowing the rejections that you experienced, with university, and the rejections that you had experienced as an author, I now see so much of you in Beatriz, and in her resilience, and that internal drive that she had to keep going when the world was, against her, and everything said that she should just, give up and be grateful and take the charity of her family that was resentfully given. So how cathartic of a process was it for you to create Beatriz? And what was that personal connection to you for that special character?
This is a fantastic question that I've actually never been asked before, so I might wander through it a little bit, but I think it was I think writing a book is already a cathartic experience, because when you finish a manuscript of 90-something thousand words, especially if you wrote it as quickly as I did, it felt like a high. I remember the day I finished this book, I was sobbing, crying, screaming, throwing up. It was to be hyperbolic, but it was a physical sensation of intense relief, like after you finish running a long race. So on that level, in and of itself, it was immensely cathartic. I think secondly, I think it was a really interesting experience to write both Beatriz and Andres, because Beatriz, you're right, there's a lot of me in her. And I think this is true of many novels that are published early in an author's writing career. This is not the first novel I've written. I think it's like only the 5th or so. And so I was kind of still getting stuff out of my system, working through some things. But one thing I felt very passionately about was creating female characters. And this is true of Juana as well, where their ambition is not the thing that makes them evil. I wanted to write, and I partially chose this period, this historical period, because it was one in which women at the end of this 11-year war had slightly more autonomy than they might have before, because in the case of women like Beatriz and Juana, who were connected to agricultural estates, they were women whose fathers, brothers, husbands died, were killed in battle, who then were either widowed or orphaned, who then took up the reins of businesses in the city or in the countryside. And so they had more economic agency and power and agency over their lives because the men were gone. So here we go. So I've been often accused of being too ambitious or wanting too much. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that what makes you evil in the case of the villain of this novel will be something different. But ambition in and of itself, and being somebody who wants something and who will fight for it and who will work really hard for it, is not, especially in women, it's not a bad thing. So I felt very powerfully, especially when writing a woman in the Gothic tradition, I felt very powerfully that I wanted to read a character who would fight back. I was really inspired by the work of Shirley Jackson. If any audience members are familiar with The Haunting of Hill House or with Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, the protagonist of which doesn't even have a name. She doesn't even have a first name. She's just Mrs. De Winter. There were so many moments where these women are at the mercy of the things that are haunting them and kind of at the mercy of the men around them. And I just wanted them to fight back. And maybe this is me projecting a bit because, not to be stereotypical, but I guess I am that feisty Latina who wants to fight all the time. But like, I really wanted to read a heroine who would fight. And so I wrote Beatriz. Writing Andres was also very cathartic. I was raised in a deeply Catholic household and I'm not religious. I actually never thought I would ever write a character who had as many thoughts about religion as this priest in this book has. But he embodies a lot of the struggles that I faced when I was a child, being that he is mestizo, so his father in the book is of white Spanish descent and his mother is of indigenous descent. So he is the child of a household with two different cultural traditions tugging at him. And also he lives and breathes these conflicts, these inner conflicts of faith and belonging and identity that I also lived as a child, being the daughter of parents of different cultural backgrounds and heritages and not really knowing where I fit in the world. So writing this book was super cathartic. And have I figured these things out for myself? Not really, but at least they're in a book now. So, you know, they're paying for their supper.
There you go. They're earning their keep. If they're taking up space in your head, they might as well be contributing to the household, right? Oh, I love that, Isabel. You know, thinking about the strength of the women in the story, and they all, you know, there's so many incredible female characters, all with different personalities. You know, we have Beatriz, who's the lead character and the protagonist, and Paloma, and you know, her personality is sort of in the background. Ana Luisa, and then Juana, who is just, oh, she's terrifying but thrilling at the same time. You know, how important was it for you, thinking about these strong female characters, to make a statement about the strength of females overall, and the fact that so many of these women were victims of the time period in which they lived, versus telling a story that just had that as sort of a running theme in it? You know, is the Hacienda a statement, or is it a story that makes a statement?
I think it's first and foremost a story that makes a statement. I think my intentions here were first and foremost, to tell a suspenseful yarn that maybe kept you up at night, that maybe gave you a nightmare or two. All that, I'm glad. I'm sorry also, but I'm glad. This book actually gave my agent nightmares. Yeah, she says she doesn't represent horror, and I was like, sorry, I have a horror book. Here you go. But that's another story. But I think I was very aware of writing characters with agency. And going back to Tyler's question, when I was writing short fiction, one thing that is good about short fiction is that you begin and end. So you finish lots of full, complete pieces and can look at them with a bird's eye view when they're done. And you can notice, you finish them faster than you would a novel. So you have more of them and you can notice patterns that crop up. And so one thing I noticed after this writing workshop that I took, where I wrote a lot of short fiction, is that I struggle to write characters with agency and who struggle in order to achieve their goals. But more importantly, I needed to write more active characters. And so I think my characters were too passive, too reactive. And so I think more than being aware of writing strong female characters, I think I was going into this book and my other work, I think I try to be more aware of writing characters with agency. The fact that they happen to be women, I think comes from the fact that I come from a family of very ambitious, driven, charismatic women who want things and who work really hard to achieve them. My mother is one of 5 siblings, 4 of whom are girls, and then a boy at the end. I come up from a family of 5 siblings, 4 of whom are girls, a boy at the end. There's beautiful symmetry there. My grandmother asked me if I would have 5 kids, and I said, absolutely not. I love the pattern, but I'm not that committed to it. I think the fact that I write women like Beatriz and Juana and Paloma, who has opinions. I think she has the best one-liners in this book. I may be biased, but those are my thoughts. And Ana Luisa is because I am surrounded by women who defy stereotypes, who are powerful in different ways, who have their own flaws. And I think it's really important in media to not only see women depicted in movies and TV and books as who break stereotypes, who are fully fleshed out individuals, who are fresh and interesting and flawed, who are allowed to be that way, just as men have always been allowed to be that way. But it is even more important to depict women of color in that way as well in media, because so often, especially Latinas, often get shoved into stereotypes, you know? Where like the hot mom from Modern Family or the maid or, you know, usually the maid, frankly. And so I thought it was deeply important to me to have a cast of women in this book who represent just a slice of the colorful individuality and diversity that we are. Because, yeah, I think I've said my bit.
And you let each one of them just be on their own, and each of them brought such personality and richness to the story. So, and just a reminder, selfishly, I'll ask you all questions all day long, and we have 2 more that I'm going to get to in just a second in the chat. And so just an encouragement to please do ask Isabel questions and you know, make the most of this time. But as you said, Paloma has the best one-liners in the book. And one of the ones that she says that did give me absolute nightmares was when she says to Beatrice, "You'll die here." And it's repeated in the book. And again, I consumed the book via Audible. And so I want to go to that for a second and chat about your process of having the book out in the world in that type of a format, in different formats, whether it's, you know, the hardcover, the traditional, or the audio version, or people reading an ebook. But talk to us about the Audible version and how you selected the people who became Andres and Beatriz.
Going back to surprises in publishing, I didn't think I was going to get this opportunity. I also didn't know that I was going to have 2 narrators for both point of view characters. I think this is something that my publisher absolutely knocked out of the park. My publisher is called Berkeley. They're part of Penguin Random House, and they crushed it. So what happened was I got an email a few months before the book was published from the audio producer of the book saying that they'd chosen a director and they were hunting down, they had invited people to audition for the 2 roles of Beatriz and Andres. And they also, one thing that was really important to me, because there's so much Spanish in this book and also bits of indigenous languages, is that I wanted people who would pronounce that authentically. And so not only was the director of the audiobook, also I learned that audiobooks have directors, who knew? The director of the audiobook was of Latinx heritage, as were every single actor they auditioned. So that was really important to me. And the majority of the actors who auditioned, 18 of them in all, were Mexican or Mexican American. So I got, I think, 8 or 9 auditions for each point of view character, and I listened to them all. The auditions for Andres were that passage that I read to you all earlier, that opening passage, and then for Beatriz, we were slightly deeper in the book. And for each character, for each actor, the last audition I listened to was it. So I listened to like 8 or 9. I was like, oh, that's good. Write down the name. No, definitely not. What, like, because I have a very vivid idea of what the characters sound like in my mind. I spent, you know, weeks and months with them, like chattering away in my head. Like all writers have a bunch of imaginary friends yakking away at the back of their mind all the time. So I'm intimately acquainted with these made up people. And so I had opinions. But when I heard the last audition for each, I was like, that's it. That's the one I want. And so the actor for, they're not very well-known voice actors. Victoria Villarreal, I believe, is the actress who plays Beatriz, and then Leo Osorio is the actor who plays Andres, and they do magnificent jobs. I cannot really listen to my own work being read aloud. It's weird. It's like listening to your own voice recorded, you know, you're like, oh, I don't recognize that. It's icky. Take it away. But my husband was listening to the audio. He wanted to hear the full audiobook, so he listened to it out loud because he does what he wants. So I would walk into the bedroom and hear him listening to it aloud, and I was like, oh wow, it doesn't sound like my words. It sounded like somebody else's story when it was performed by someone else. So if you love audiobooks, I recommend the Audible, or also there is a website called libro.fm. So Libro, Libro.fm, that where you can buy audiobooks and the proceeds go to the independent bookstore of your choice. So as is my you know, my role as an author, support your independent bookstores, please, please, please. But using Libro FM can ensure that like some of those proceeds go to independent bookstores instead of feeding the monster that is Amazon. Although I also have an Audible subscription and I use it. But the audiobook is pretty good. It's pretty good, if I do say so myself.
Oh,
the actors
phenomenal.
Crushed it.
Yes, it is absolutely phenomenal. It almost feels like Beatrice is like whispering to you the whole time. It's like
She's so good. She gives me the creeps. Oh, it's so good.
It's so good. Okay, so I'm going to go. Tyler has one more question about Gothic stories. So here we go. How do you think Gothic stories fit into the binary between literary and commercial fiction, given that they may incorporate both speculative genre elements and an arguably antiquated style of flowery language? So that is Tyler's question, and then I'll get to Philippa next.
That's a fantastic question. I think the Gothic allowed, I very much identify as a genre writer. I've always loved fantasy and some science fiction, and I love me some horror. I'm not into like creepy slasher stuff. I'm actually very bad with horror movies, but I love scary vampire books. Like I said earlier, I love Dracula. So coming at the publishing industry as a genre writer, I kind of expected, in fact, I did expect to be shunted into, I expected to be, for my book to be bought by a publisher that publishes genre fiction specifically. I expected to be marketed that way. But Tyler, you're really insightful in the way that you pinpoint how, yeah, Gothic actually occupies this middle space. I think there are a lot of readers who enjoy genre without, I think who are genre curious, if you will, who maybe prefer historical fiction, maybe prefer women's fiction, maybe prefer literary fiction generally, but who will happily accept a book that is that dabbles in those while adding a healthy dose of the speculative. So I've been very lucky to be marketed to the mainstream, so to speak. I'm the only of all of my friends who are in the genre space, because most of my networking and connections are in genre. I think there are very few of us who have crossed over in that regard. And so the Gothic allowed me that opportunity, for which I'm really grateful. It also means that I get to write ghost stories, which dream come true.
Love it. Who wouldn't want that? So I have a question from Philippa asking, will you be coming to the UK and please home to St. Andrews to do any promotional events anytime soon?
I don't have anything planned. I think that's a fantastic idea. I visited St. Andrews in July, actually, for the first time in like 8 or 9 years. I was there for like 24 hours because I was on a pretty tightly scheduled trip, but it was incredible. And like, what is that bookstore? It's not on North Street. Yeah, it's amazing. I popped in. It wasn't, I think it opened the year after I graduated. And I was like, I spoke to the booksellers. I told them about my book. I told them I was an alumna. I popped into Waterstones, told them to order my book because I'm an alumna. The Hacienda is difficult to find in hardcover in the UK. My publisher has not been like, the distribution is a bit spotty. Usually you can find it in a Waterstones. I know you can order it from Amazon. But as for promotion, there are no plans currently, but I think this event is going kind of well. So maybe I can report back to my publisher about it and tell them, maybe you should send me to St. Andrews to appear in person. I think that would be glorious. I would love that. So nothing planned at the moment. I think my promotion for the Hacienda, it is ramping up again now in advance of Halloween season, of course, and Latinx Heritage Month in the US, which lasts from September 15th to October 15th. But after that, we don't really have anything planned, and certainly not in the UK. But one day.
One day we will pack the beautifully renovated Younger Hall for you with people eager to hear from you. So I have a hello from a friend with also a question. So Sarah Boyle is writing in from Chicago, says no news since first year, of course. And second, what is your dream historical novel that you plan to write?
I would love to write something set in the Ottoman Empire, in the 16th century Ottoman Empire. Sazzle knows how obsessed I am with this period and how it's the Ottoman Empire is something I've studied for 7 years over the course of my PhD. I hope that is on the horizon. I would love to do it. I have an idea for kind of like a thriller whodunit with a little bit of murder, a little bit of ghosts set in the Ottoman imperial court in the 16th century. But at the moment, one thing that is true about publishing, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, is that when you have a brand as an author and you're just starting out, it is kind of good to hew to that brand because you start to build a readership based on your first book, your second book, and readers know that if I want X experience, I will get that out of Isabel's writing. So I will continue to buy her books. So right now I'm kind of writing the Mexican Gothic pony, and it's like the best pony ever to ride. Like I'm having a fantastic time coming up with ideas that are historical and dark and have some horror, have maybe a touch of the supernatural, have a touch of the speculative set in this period. My books that are coming out in 2023 and 2024, which are not announced yet. This is very secret information. Also play in this pool, so to speak. So I'm happy to be here, but in the future, I would love to write something where I do not let my knowledge of the period overburden me, but I would love to write something set in the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century.
Love it. Put that PhD to use in the next one. I know. In the meanwhile, I'm starting the petition for the Hacienda sequel, so get ready for that. We have a question from another alumnus, Fernando Gutierrez Eddy, writing in from New York. Thank you for the inspiration as another Mexican-American writer. Any advice on finding an agent?
Write the best book you possibly can. Edit the bejesus out of it. have other people read it. I'm sure if you're already thinking of finding an agent, you probably know this, but I cannot stress it enough. The querying process right now has really been slowed down. There's still like a backlog from the pandemic. So it is slightly more difficult now to get an agent, but I strongly recommend revising, making sure that your book is as good as it can possibly be, and also making sure that your query letter is sharp, that it really, really sings. Get everyone you possibly can, especially other querying writers and other writers who have recently gotten agents, to read it and give you feedback on it. So for those who don't know, a query letter is your path to getting an agent. Basically, you send letters, emails, to agents saying, hello, I am so-and-so. This is what my book is about. It is this many words. It fits into this niche in the market. Do you want to represent me? And I'd say like 95% of the time they will say, no, thank you. But sometimes they may ask you to revise the book and send it back to them. Sometimes they will say yes immediately. So in order to nail that process, it takes a lot of resilience. So Fernando, I really, really encourage you to not give up. Never give up. I think, as I spoke about earlier, there is a ton of rejection. And I think for Mexican American and other Latinos in the US specifically, one thing that publishing does is it wants a certain kind of narrative from us. And I think this is true of other BIPOC writers in the US as well. Unfortunately, there is still an expectation that we will perform our marginalizations and perform trauma in such a way that is palatable to a mainstream audience. Write what you want to write, because that is what will make your work sing. And do it with all the heart you can, and please don't give up, because we need your stories.
Oh, that is so important, Isabel. Thank you for that. And you're so right. I mean, there's this idea of performative trauma and performative cultural expectation, and that cannot be allowed to stand. And the resilience with which you have pushed this book through, I think is going to be a huge inspiration for others to write their story and write their truth. Thank you for that. So to get a little bit personal, I want to ask you something that in reading your acknowledgments, I have to say, as a mother, this just had me waterworks. And so I want to read what you wrote to your mother and have you reflect on it in just a few minutes that we have left here. So you say, I thank my mother for raising me hardworking and definitely too daydreamy, which is such a gift. And this, for cultivating a freewheeling homeschool education where we ran barefoot through books, where I had the space to read, dream, and most importantly, to write. Can you share with us what that freedom meant to you and how you carry that with you today?
My mother homeschooled me and my siblings, all 5 of us at various points in our primary school education. I know I was homeschooled for the longest period we returned to the US from Mexico when I was about 7. I went to school for a bit, was bored out of my mind. And I think my mother was too, frankly. So we were a bit her intellectual experiment. We read voraciously, and my mother has always had thousands of books in her house. And so we had free reign to read whatever we wanted, which meant that I got my hands on historical fiction about the Black Plague full of death when I was about 11 years old, probably too young. But it really cultivated, my mom was really passionate about cultivating curiosity in us. One thing she always said whenever we asked her, like, well, what does X mean or what does Y mean? She'd say, look it up. And so we'd go to like the Britannica, Encyclopedia Britannica that we had on the shelves, pull it out, look it up, and then find out. And so I think on the one hand, that taught me, if I'm interested in where would the money be in 1823 Mexico after, the War for Independence left a lot of the economy shattered? Well, alcohol. So I looked it up. So I also had, I think in hindsight, I could have spent a lot more time in structured learning, especially as regards algebra and sciences. I think it was a very uneven education, frankly, and I really learned that quickly when I went to an actual school for high school. But I learned how to manage my own time and to pursue what I loved, which I think are two skills that are so important in the world we live in today, because there's so many demands on our time and we can get caught up in the rat race so quickly that I think we lose sight of pursuing what we love, either as a hobby or as a career. The world out there is scary. I think we're facing a world that has a lot of political and financial insecurity. So it can be scary sometimes to carve out space for us to pursue what we love and to manage our time in such a way that leaves time for us to nurture our own curiosity and the space in which we can just be our excited 11-year-old selves. Like, I think the beautiful thing that I am grateful for every single morning when I wake up is the fact that I get to do what I love doing as like a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old, an 11-year-old writing Lord of the Rings fan fiction for hours instead of doing my math homework. I get to do that every day, and I think that's an incredible gift. It's a responsibility I do not take lightly. I work really hard to make my books as good as they can possibly be. But I thank my mother for that, for creating that space where I could be curious, where I could do what I loved, where I could read anything. And write all day long, which was fantastic. But yeah, I got a lot of C's in high school math.
Well, you're doing something right. So, tell your
I still got a PhD. I still got a
PhD, and they can't take that away from you.
Exactly.
I'm going to steal one more minute of time, just because, as our incoming students will start arriving in St. Andrews next week, and I think you'll be so pleased to hear that they embody what your ethos is, that of a relentless learner. And that's still the type of student that comes to St. Andrews and thrives at St. Andrews. And so as they prepare to descend in Northeast Fife in just a week or so, a couple of rapid fire questions for you. Your favorite St. Andrews, ready? Your favorite St. Andrews coffee shop, go.
Taste.
Beach.
West Sands.
Academic family memory.
We got dressed up as, we weren't paddle bots. We were Transformers for the shaving foam fight.
That's amazing.
It was brilliant.
Favorite time of year in St. Andrews?
September. It's sunny, it's fresh, everything's new, everything's full of promise, it's exciting. Yeah, September.
Love it. Restaurant.
Maisha. Love Maisha. Went to Maisha all the time.
Oh, love it. Study space.
I was always on the 4th floor of the library with Sarah Boyle.
There you go. And last but not least, what was your favorite class in your 4 years at St. Andrews?
That's a tough one, but I have to say, in my second semester of 4th year, I took a medieval history module with Dimitris Kastristis, which was the classical Ottoman Empire, 1300 to 1600, and that's what I ended up getting my PhD in. So, thanks, Dimitri.
That works
yeah,
well.
for better or for worse, it put me on the path to where I am today.
Fantastic. Isabel, thank you so much for your time and your energy. Again, it was just such a privilege to welcome you home to St. Andrews. We hope to welcome you back physically quite soon, and wish you all the best of luck. We will be petitioning for the sequel to the Hacienda, and know that your other book is forthcoming, and we'll be keeping an eye on that. Thank you all so much for joining today for another terrific Meet the Author from the University of St. Andrews.